we actually find. Again, we're dealing with an issue of it is not science in the traditional sense when we come to origins, because it's not something that's observable, it's not something that's testable, it's not something we can experiment with, any of those kinds of things. So it's what we call historical science. In other words, we're dealing with something that was in the past, that was a one-time event, whether you're talking about creation or whether you're talking about evolution. Both of them would predict that it was evolution. There was a one-time event around 13 and a half to 15 billion years ago that we commonly call the Big Bang theory. There were no observers to that. It is not a repeatable event. It's not something we can repeat in a laboratory. And so, again, it falls outside of the realm of what is normal science. Same thing with creation. It was a one-time event, supernatural in design. And so when you talk about historical science, all we can do is then take a look at what we do observe today, and then build a model based off of your view. So if it's creation, then here's my predictive model. Here's what I would expect if God did create the world in 6 days. If there was actually a universal flood, here's what I would expect to see in the world today. And then we go and we look at what we can observe and see, does it actually fit that model? If evolution happened, then I create a model. Here's what I would expect to see several billion years later if life did evolve from, molecules to man, process by random chance. Here's what I should expect to see in the world around me today. And then I look at what we observe and see, is that actually the case? And so I build two predictive models, and then I see what does the evidence actually best fit. And we looked at last week kind of what is called catastrophism, which is kind of the creationist view. In other words, a catastrophe, specifically something on the level and the scale and the impact of the flood and the impact that would have had upon the earth. And I think too often we don't understand or we don't teach the devastating impact. We have to remember this was God's wrath visited upon the entire earth to deal with sin, to eliminate and wipe out all life, save Noah and his family. And from what the Bible records, while it doesn't give us every single detail, we are not just talking about, some spattering of rain. This is rain for 40 days and 40 nights, what would be on the equivalent of a downpour, if not worse, torrential rains, storms, okay, for 40 days and 40 nights. In addition to that, it talks about the fountains of the deep. So you have the plates of the earth, water erupting, ripping those apart. And we talked about, last week that the plates moving, at the pace of meters per second, not, a few, an inch, or less a year, but rather meters per second. And those plates colliding with each other, moving at that pace, and just the devastating earthquakes. That's when your mountain ranges would have been formed, just shattering things, obliterating life on this earth, and the radical change of not only the Earth's surface, but ultimately our environment, really, as well. And that's why we have all the different temperate zones and things like that around the world. And so we can look around and see, well, is that actually what we observe? Do we observe that there was in the past some sort of massive catastrophe? And whether we're looking at the fossil record, whether we're looking at things like coal beds or oil that are formed from what we call fossils, those had to be formed in short amounts of time where there was massive death and massive burial of plants and animals. And we don't see that happening today. It's not, well, there's gradual species, dying out, and they all come and just die in the same spot and, slowly buried over years. That's not what we observe. That's not what's happening. even though that's what evolution would predict. And so when we don't see those things happening, then we have to, well, this other model seems to be fit better. So that's what we kind of talked about last week. This week, maybe a better title for this would be micro versus macro, which is going to touch on these concepts of races and breeds and so on and so forth as we go through here. But really probably the better title, and I should have changed it, would be micro versus macro evolution. And one of the things evolutionary scientists like to do is they like to kind of compare apples and oranges and say they're the same, and they're not. They also like to use terms that interchangeably that are really not interchangeable. And so that's why you have to, when talking to somebody who believes in evolution or who has maybe a little bit of knowledge about evolution, you really have to make sure that you get terms defined. What do you mean by this? Because as we'll see here, sometimes they use this term to mean this over here, and they're not the same. They are two very, very, very different things. So let's start with, if this is going to cooperate with me. Okay, we're going to be honoring again. There we go. Okay. Defining terms. The first term that we'll define is one that every scientist believes in, including creation scientists, and that is microevolution. Okay, evolution just means change. That's all it means. So we don't need to be afraid of the term evolution when it's applied to science. Evolution just means change. Things change. Okay, environments change, animals change over time, or maybe we would use the word adapt. Okay, but change is part of life. Change is part of our living world. No surprise there. Microevolution is small changes, or better yet, the scientific term is usually variations within a species. And you'll notice the term there is within a species. So this is not talking about, going from, a fish to growing legs and becoming some sort of reptile, which in turn becomes some sort of bird, and so on and so forth. So this is not talking about what is typically thought of as evolution. This is microevolution. It happens all the time. We're going to use one of the examples that Darwin used here. We're going to talk about it. Darwin's finches. Okay, that's one of his famous examples that he included in his Origin of Species, and he observed, well, there's all these different species, as he said, of finches, and the main thing that he noticed was different about them was their beaks, and the ability of some to survive better than others in certain periods. That is microevolution. It's still a finch. Matter of fact, it's not just that it's still a bird, it's still a finch, okay? And the finch was not going to evolve into an eagle. Even in the years since Darwin, we have not seen finches evolve into a hawk or an eagle or a parrot or anything like that. And even if they did, somehow, it would still be a bird, okay? It has not changed what it is by any stretch of the imagination. The other type, and this is what evolutionists are typically referring to when they use the term evolution, is macroevolution. And that is the growth or changing of one organism to another, what we often call molecules to man evolution. And all those things you may have seen in a textbook of all those supposed transitional forms, that is, you move from some kind of one-celled creature to multi-celled creatures to eventually fish growing legs, of some sort, crawling out of the ocean, and eventually you have reptiles, and reptiles at some point in time kind of growing some kind of feather type thing and becoming birds, and on and on and on you go. Okay, those kinds of large changes. Here's the big difference between these two. See if I put this up here. I think I did. Variations, so this would be microevolution, are not mutations. Okay, mutations is this big fanciful word that evolutionists have kind of created in order to, there's something new to the genetic code. Variations are not mutations, they're just reconfigurations of genetic code that already exists, which is what the Bible would predict. The Bible would, God created everything, God created Adam and Eve, and any of the other animals with all, when he created it was very good. All the genetic information that would ever be needed for mankind existed within Adam and Eve. Since then, obviously, do we have different people with different color hair, different skin color, different facial features? Obviously, okay? And that all comes from different combinations of that genetic code. And we'll talk about why in some areas of the world, why do you get people with, darker skin, in other areas of the world you get people with lighter skin, or why are some hair colors more prominent in certain areas of the world? Well, guess what? The Bible predicts that as well. It has to do with the Tower of Babel, okay, in Genesis chapter 11. And we'll get there a little bit later. But that has nothing to do with mutations. That's genetic code that's already there, that you have a certain particular character trait, genetic character trait, that is now concentrated and it comes out in the next offspring. It's a reconfiguration of something that already exists. Macroevolution would talk about mutations, and that requires adding genetic code that does not already exist. How do you get from an amoeba of some single-celled organism to man? Well, obviously a single-celled organism is far less complex and does not contain the genetic information that we do in our incredibly complex bodies. And so somewhere along the line, that genetic information had to be added. So where was it added? Where did it come from? And that becomes the big question. Now, if I believe in evolution, then it had to happen. So I have to find a way to explain how it happened, because that's my belief system. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in any kind of supernatural creation. So somehow, all this genetic information that we have today had to be added, and it had to be added slowly because I don't observe it happening in any way quickly today. So it had to be slowly, so that's why it requires, 1.5 billion years to get from molecules to man. Oops. And so here's kind of our two models, if you want to look at it this way. You have evolution going from one-celled organisms all the way up to mankind, and along the way, additional genetic information is being added. Over here, the creation model predicts that the kinds, while there is some change within the kinds, and you can see here, different colors of iguanas or whatever, different colors of toads, okay, different types of toads, different kinds of fish and things like that, they're still going to remain within their kind. You have different, breeds of dogs, and we're going to talk about breeds of dogs today a little bit. You have different breeds of dogs, okay, but they're still dogs, okay, they're still within their kind. We have different, what we would call races of humans, okay, but again, they're all humans, okay, they're basically indistinguishable from one another genetically. And so I'm going to go over just a couple quick textbook examples, because these are still often included in textbooks, and unfortunately what's not included in these textbooks is the flaws to them, and this is where scientists will, or evolutionists will put in, and they will use microevolution to promote macroevolution, okay, or to teach macroevolution. And again, that's comparing apples and oranges. As a matter of fact, it's more like comparing, I don't know, broccoli and salmon or something. Yeah, it's so far apart, okay, that it's ridiculous. It's really not scientific at all when you come to it. So Darwin's finches is one of the big ones, of course, because Darwin went on his great voyage, and one of the big things that he observed, were these finches. As he made his observations, and he saw, I think it was like 15 different species of finches, and one of the distinguishing features were their beaks that he observed. And these beak changes allowed some of them to survive better during times of drought, okay, where it was hard to find food. And some of these, because they had a beak that had, maybe it was longer, you know, it could reach food better, or maybe the beak was shaped in such a way that it could crack, you know, hard nuts and get to food that was harder to access, that normally finches wouldn't have gone for that food, but now that it's a drought and food is hard to get, this is kind of what's left over. And so some finches would be able to do it, and we get to that whole survival of the fittest. Other finches whose beaks weren't that way were not adapted as well to survive. The problem is that that's not macroevolution. It's not a finch evolving into something else. Matter of fact, it's not really even a finch evolving at all. It's simply reconfigurations of the genetic code, and it's not done by nature in an intelligent way. It's not like nature realizes, oh, there's a drought, we need to reconfigure the beak so that we can go get access to food or water or whatever it might be. There are some finches that already had this particular genetic character trait, and when the environment changed, they were better able to survive. So they flourished, and their particular strain of DNA was passed on to the next generation. Those that did not have that beak design kind of began to were less able to adapt and died out. That has nothing to do with actual evolution. Another one is the peppered moth, very similar example. This one was in textbooks for many, many years, and still is often found in there. And again, this is used as an example of, see, evolution is happening. These moths change. And this study was done I think in the 1850s originally, which is about the same time that Darwinism, Darwin published his findings. This was done in England, and there are actually this species of moth called the peppered moth. The vast majority of them are usually kind of a whitish color with some dark spots on their wings. And there is another variation of the same moths that are dark in color with some spots on their wings as well. But the dark ones are much less common. And so the study was done, and what they observed is that suddenly, the population of the dark moths, which had been, I think like 10% of the population, if I remember correctly originally, rose significantly. And the reason they believed was that what had happened during the 1850s, in that time period, was also known as the Industrial Revolution, and there was a lot of pollution on the trees and the forests where these moths lived. And so the darker ones, because of the pollution, were now better able to camouflage themselves against the tree trunks and things like that. And so they're natural predators, the birds couldn't see them. And so these moths, they evolved to change from going light to dark. Well, the problem is, no, they didn't evolve. There were two types of the moth that already existed. And the issue was simply that as the pollution happened, the white one became more exposed to predators, so it got eaten more frequently. And so the dark ones were around to breed. And so, of course, as you breed more, if you have more of those to breed around, then what do you get? You get more dark moths. That's not evolution. It's not that there was anything new added to the genetic code. And at the end of the day, they're still pepper moths. They didn't even evolve into any other kind of moth. They're still pepper moths, and guess what? They're still today. They're still pepper moths. Matter of fact, later on, it was found out that the study that was done by this gentleman had some very serious flaws and some fraudulent photos that had been taken later on in the study, a number of years after that. As that study was done, I think in the 90s, they found out that photos that, as people went back to rehash this study, they actually had taken these moths, which don't actually spend a lot of time on trees. That's not their common residing place. And that's where the study was supposedly focusing on, that some of these supposed scientists had actually taken dead moths and glued them onto trees and things like that for their study. I can show you a picture here of the pepper moths, and you can kind of see what they're talking about. Each picture has two moths, and obviously in this one it's very, very hard to see the light one. Here, I believe it's right there, because it's on a light tree. Okay, this is kind of the normal habitat with lichen on it, and the pollution killed the lichen and darkened the tree. And here you can kind of see that it's very difficult to see the darker one. It blends in really well. Okay, that's adaptation. That's not actually evolution. Okay, breeds of dogs. We're going to spend a little bit of time kind of talking about this. And again, this is another thing we're taking microevolution and trying to say, no, see, this is evidence of evolution actually happening. And so we're going to take a look at that in a bit here. Mutations of bacteria and viruses. This is a great one to talk about now because we just recently had a virus mutate, okay? We thought we'd beat COVID, and then we got the what? Yeah, the Delta variant, which was a mutation, okay? And the reality is probably in another year or two, or maybe less than that, there will be another mutation that's common. That's why we haven't been able to cure the common cold, because there are so many different mutations and variations of the common cold. We can't actually find any kind of vaccine for that. I want to say it's over 200 different variations and mutations to the common cold. Same thing with pesticides. The animals eventually build up resistance to pesticides, and so the pesticide that we used to use to kill off a mosquito or whatever doesn't work anymore. Okay, and here's kind of how that works. So here's an example of a particular type of virus. Okay, so here's the normal one. It produces enzymes. You can apply an antibiotic to that. It kills it. Okay, and then you have a mutation which does not produce any enzymes, and it survives because what does the antibiotic actually attack? It attacks the enzymes, okay, within the virus. Well, if it doesn't produce any of these enzymes, then the antibiotic is now useless. It's ineffective, and so it survives and it continues to reproduce offspring that resist those particular antibiotics. See, mutation, evolution is true, right? Well, this is not actually an example of evolutionary mutation, because actually what happened, okay, is this. It survived here because of less genetic information. As it mutated, it actually lost genetic information, which we see happening all the time. Okay, now that the realm of genetics has advanced and we've been able to look at DNA and the DNA code, map it out, our understanding of that is growing. We're finding out that these mutations, so like the Delta variant, okay, while it's more contagious and so on and so forth, it's actually a mutation which has less genetic information than the original COVID-19. And as it continues to evolve or change, it continues to lose genetic information. Well, wait a minute, what did we need to happen for macroevolution to happen? Yeah, we needed to add information. We needed more genetic information, not to lose genetic information. So when evolutionists pull out these examples here, okay, and we're going to see the same kind of thing is true of like breeds of animals, we're actually losing genetic information. We're going the opposite. This is de-evolution, not evolution, not macroevolution. It's actually the exact opposite, which fits with God's word. If you think to the fall, okay, God created everything perfect, all the genetic information that would have been needed, and then at the fall, man sinned, and corruption began to happen. Okay, sometimes what we think of as the second law of thermodynamics. Now, there is a good aspect to the second law of thermodynamics, okay? and I'm sure Ryan can tell you more about that. But, okay, there is also, I believe, there's a connection to the fall as well, in that things are tending to go from a state of order to disorder, and that includes genetically, okay, our bodies are falling apart. Adam and Eve were genetically perfect. We're not. Okay? One of the things we'll talk about is I attended a seminar about 10 or 12 years ago, and this guy was just, was a creation scientist who was doing a study on genetics, and he and another guy had written a computer program that they developed to analyze and predict the genetic code, knowing that each generation has, we have what's called genetic overload. In other words, every generation there are certain harmful mutations that occur within an organism, okay, or a species. And given enough time, those genetic harmful mutations build up to the point where the organism will not be able to reproduce anymore and will become extinct. And so he was building a predictive model, and it's basically an example of deevolution, a predictive model of all these different types of animals, including humans, and predicting that in X amount of years, how long would it take for the human species or for the tiger species to be extinct, because each species is building up these genetic overload, these mutations that are harmful to it. They're not gaining more information. Okay, so we already mentioned that mutations require new genetic information. Mutations, or even variations for that matter, have not been observed to add up in an organism to create a new one. That's significant right there, because that is exactly what evolution would predict, or has to predict would happen, is that these little mutations will eventually add up to one big new species. That's what they produce, and a lot of times we talk about transitional forms, all these little tiny changes. Well, there's a couple problems. One, there's no evidence of any transitional forms either in observational science, what we see today. We should, if evolution is actually happening, we should see really a whole bunch of transitional forms. Animals should be still in the midst of transitioning from whatever they are to something great, but they're not. And okay, even if we could give a pass to, well, generally there's kind of these long moments of stagnation and evolution that happen, and so typically you're going to observe, major kinds or major species. You're not going to observe the transitional period is fairly quick and whatever. So even if you buy into that argument, which is not a great argument, but even if you buy into that argument, then in the fossil record, there should be evidence of transitions, and there's not. It was one of the things that Darwin himself even mentioned, that, hey, this is a problem. The fossil record really doesn't have transitional forms. It doesn't show going from one organism to another. His belief was, though, that paleontology was fairly new. We hadn't discovered a lot of fossils during his era, so he was assuming, well, as that science continues to develop, we're obviously going to find a lot of fossils that will be transitional forms. Except now we've done a lot of that research, 170 some odd years later, and we're still looking for those transitional forms. And we'll talk a little bit about those transitional forms later. Okay, so this kind of science we don't see happening. Matter of fact, and I think I'll mention it in another lesson, but a guy named Michael Behe back in the 90s wrote a really, really groundbreaking book that kind of, he wasn't a believer. I don't know if he is a believer now or not, but at the time he wasn't a believer. But he was kind of joining what was called the intelligent design movement. He was an evolutionist, and he kind of looked at as he studied things and like, that doesn't make any sense. And he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And his basic premise was, he was a molecular biologist, And as he studied certain things, even very simple things, he realized you can't have just pieces and parts added slowly over time because of something that he called irreducible complexity. And he used the example of like a mousetrap, which is much more simple than any of the parts, even the one he uses, which is the flagellum motor on a one-celled organism, is what he was actually studying, which is far more complex than a mousetrap. But he used the example of a mousetrap in that a mousetrap, you can't slowly put pieces in over time and eventually you have a working mousetrap. No, either all the pieces are there or it doesn't work. Yeah, it's worthless. It's pointless. And so when we go to what we call natural selection, well, the whole purpose of natural selection is to weed out those things that don't work, that aren't good for the organism, survival of the fittest kind of concept, kind of idea. So if there are mutations that are just kind of there, they've added something new, so even if that actually happened, but it doesn't really add any benefit, then natural selection should, in theory, just weed that out. And he did this thing with the flagellum motor, and I think, I want to say there were like 20 or 30 different pieces. I forgot to look it up. But they all have to be there at once, working together in concert. If any one of those pieces is missing, it's a completely useless piece of equipment for that one-celled organism. And so you have this idea that it's not just that I can have pieces added, I need all those pieces all at once, all working together, which then implies that there has to be an intelligence and a plan of not only is there going to be a mutation, but I have to plan for this mutation and what advantage is it going to add to the organism. Oh, now we're getting into the idea of an intelligence. That's a problem. Okay? And there's no process that's been discovered for introducing. Where does all this new genetic information going to come from? Because it doesn't exist in the original organism. So where are you going to get it to pass on to the next organism? Matter of fact, here's a really interesting one. How do you go from non-life molecules, which don't contain DNA, to something living that does contain DNA? Where did you get the DNA code to begin with? Okay, and if you've ever studied DNA code or learned about it in high school or whatever, it is incredibly complex. Okay, the amount of information that is stored in a single DNA strand, it could fill up libraries and libraries. I mean, if you, I once heard a comparison compared to the Library of Congress and the amount of volumes that are stored in there. And if you've ever been there, it's an enormous building, 3 stories with, and that's not counting what books they have stored in basements or whatever. The wealth of information that's in that is amazing. And one DNA strand contains more than is in the entire Library of Congress. I mean, that is a massive amount of information. Okay, and we already mentioned natural selection is capable of deleting unnecessary or harmful information, but not adding new. There is no process and no thing that we can see or observe today that can add new genetic information. Yes?
You'd think that the only way more genetic material could be added is through the breeding process and the other bringing some of that material with it.
Well, you would think, okay? And that's what they point to a lot of times is the breeding process. Well, see, we get this new type of dog or whatever, but it's actually the opposite. It's actually we end up with less genetic information. I'm going to show you that here in a minute. So positive mutation, therefore, is nothing but science fiction. There's no science about it other than that it's fiction. There are no positive mutations that we can observe. There's no process to add genetic information to the process, which is exactly what the Bible would have predicted. Okay, the Bible predicts that God made all the kinds, okay, during the creation process, and since then, yes, you have varying recombinations of some of those genetic codes, so that we have differences. We have differences in us as humans. We have different dog breeds. We have different types of monkeys, whatever. But they still remain that particular species. Okay. This is a book that was written in 1998, and the gentleman Lee Spetner made this point. All point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not increase it. Going on, he said, not even one mutation has been observed that adds a little information to the genome. Okay, so not one have we ever observed. Sometimes, maybe in science class you heard, or in textbooks, they'll talk about like fruit fly experiment. Okay, and they'll do, they like to do fruit flies a lot of times because you can go within a very short amount of time, you can go through multiple generations of fruit flies and observe different changes that they have. And do they undergo quote unquote mutations? Absolutely. But every time you do that, you end up with, again, they're harmful mutations. They're not mutations that benefit or add to the organism. Okay. Now in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, if we go to Genesis chapter 1 and where it starts talking about living creatures, it mentions according to its kind, okay, or according to their kinds, at least 10 times just in that short section, where starting really on the 5th day, okay, so the 5th and 6th day is all we're talking about here. So those 2 days, which would start in, I believe, verse 20 there, 10 times God mentions created according to its kind, or according to their kinds, that God mentions there. So in other words, he created a dog kind, he created a cat kind, he created a horse kind, he created mankind, okay? And within each one, there's enough genetic information to get some differences, okay? But not changing a dog into, one of Darwin's kind of concepts was this idea of, oh, well, bears, they like to fish and they like to, go get fish. And so he visualized this concept of, hey, well, bears are mammals and whales are mammals. So how did we get mammals, which were supposedly the top of the evolutionary chain? How did you get mammals back in the water? Because supposedly we came out of the water onto the land. That was kind of the evolutionary cycle. So how did you get mammals back in the water? Well, something must have liked the water, and as it went for food, eventually over time developed some kind of fins, so he envisioned some kind of bear-like creature, ancient bear-like creature or something similar to it that would spend a lot of time in the water. And so over time it slowly developed some kind of fin-like legs, and eventually became the ancestor to the modern whale, and it crawled back into the ocean. And we'll look a little bit more along those lines in another lesson. Nowadays we know that's kind of silly, even though evolutionists still have that past. Something mammalian somehow eventually went back into the ocean and developed those kinds of necessary appendages to be able to swim around and those kind of things. God said, nope, we created, all the mammals that live in the ocean, all the fish that live in the ocean, they are created according to their kind, and they remain according to their kind. And so dealing with breeds and races and those kinds of things that are often pointed to as evidence of evolution, and again, this is comparing, it's taking microevolution and trying to say, oh, well, this is evidence of macroevolution, and it's completely actually the opposite. One, there's enough genetic information in the genetic code to allow for very minor differences between breeds and races. Plenty of genetic information. As we've expanded our study in science of the genetic code and our understanding of genetics, and that's growing year by year, we are understanding more, and really the father of all this, does anybody remember who the father of
Mendel?
Yes, Mendel, okay, who started the concept of that. And obviously, since we've discovered the DNA strand and how that works, our concept and understanding of that has advanced tremendously. Just to give you an idea of kind of numerically, and again, this is a number that is beyond our comprehension. This is kind of the estimated number of atoms in the known universe. Now, honestly, I don't even know how they came up with this number. But again, it's a number that, once we get out to about here, I mean, okay, the numbers beyond that are like really beyond our comprehension, because they're not really anything that we deal with. We can kind of fathom in the millions. You get out to the billions, and I've heard of a few people who have like $1 billion, so I can kind of fathom that. I will never have that, but I at least heard of it. And then trillions, our national debt's in the trillions. I still really don't know what a trillion is, but I know our national debt's there. And then you start getting beyond that. Okay, I know there's these other numbers, like quadrillion, but I don't know really what those are. You can put a lot of zeros after them, but it becomes these numbers that are just kind of mind-blowing. And it should make us kind of appreciate the vastness of God, really, that there is this amount of atoms in the entire universe that we know of, okay? And the reality is it's very possible that there's things out there that we have not even been able to see or understand, or that our understanding of the universe and its vastness is limited. There could be more than this, we don't know. But just in relationship to this, with the DNA code that is built into mankind, this is the number of children that one man and one woman could have without them ever looking the same. Okay? Not saying that, we're not saying that they need to have this many. Okay, I don't think you could ever do that. You would have to live this many years, I'm assuming. But the point is, this is the vastness of the genetic code that God built in to us. And so when you compare that to something like even the atoms within the universe, which is mind-blowing, this is, I don't even know what this number would be. I don't even know if we have a name for it, honestly. It's a lot of zeros. And despite all of that, 10 to 2017 or whatever, and being able to have that many children with that are different from one another. The difference between races or breeds accounts for less than 0.2%, not 2%, but 0.2%. It's actually a little bit less than that, but I'm just kind of rounding up for sake of ease there. So in other words, our facial features, skin coloring, hair coloring, gender, all of that kind of stuff is less than 0.2% genetic difference and variation between us. So all these things that we point to, and here's what I would say, what that proves is exactly what God, mentioned in His Word all along, that we're all created equal. And there is no difference, between men and women, black or white, slave or free, Greek or Jew. There is no difference in what God created. We are all one. We're all created. We're all image bearers of God. We're all created in His image. And God, in His creativity, created mankind to look a little different and be a little different. And that's part of God's creative power. It is not evidence of evolution. And here you have the same thing, that it's less than 0.2%. Here you guys probably remember this, the Punnett square. You guys probably had to fill some of these out in high school. I remember doing that in biology class here. And so you have, kind of this idea of two parents. And again, anything that you filled out in high school or maybe even college, the Punnett square, this is incredibly simplified. This is just taking, a couple characteristics. This is not taking into account the entire information within the genetic code. So this was, your teachers had you do this kind of for fun, so you'd get an idea of what you can. They probably taught you to predict, okay, so if, A stood for light hair, or capital A stood for, capital A stood for dark hair, and lowercase a stood for light hair, or something like that. What could you predict would happen, with this? And the B stood for height, or something like that. Then you would end up with a light-haired short person, or whatever, depending on your combination here. Something very, very simplified. Probably starting with giving you an example of the prediction that Gregor Mendel used for his pea plants there. And so when we start talking about breeds, and again, the breeds of dogs or cats or things like that, which is often used as an example of evolution, it never results from new genetic information, but rather from a loss. And I'm going to give you kind of an example here of what that looks like. And again, this is a very simplified kind of genetic Punnett square kind of thing here. So if we take a look at the original male-female dog, would have had, both the genetic information for, let's say this was their fur color, okay? And this was the length of their fur, and this was the body type, build, or whatever. So they have the genetic information for both, okay, in there. Now maybe what's visible would be one thing, but they have the genetic information for both. So they could have quite a variety of different offspring possibilities there, okay? And so you can see as you go from something what would be like the wolf, which would be kind of the original dog kind. So you have things like huskies or things like that, which would be closer to this. They would be more genetically closer to this. As you move down to very specialized dogs, like your collies, okay, or Chihuahua, kind of at the bottom of the, food chain here, there is less and less genetic information. The Chihuahua has no ability. So if you were trying, well, can we go backwards, towards this? Does the Chihuahua have any ability to breed with another dog and produce a dog with longer legs and more fur? No, because it doesn't have that genetic information. And that's even assuming you could breed it with another type of dog, which generally they can't. Okay? You could do some crossbreeds, but to a large degree, there becomes a point where even within species, certain groups of that species can no longer breed or interbreed with one another. Again, similar. Here's another one where you have parent dogs. Okay, they're what we would call normal. In terms of their build, their legs, whatever. They have a mutation, okay, and this is where there's some kind of error that happens in the genetic code. Something is missing, something is left out as a result of that. Something is lost in that process of copying. Okay, if you remember the copying of the genetic code where the DNA unzips, okay, and it copies it and sends it on, okay, that replication process there. There are times where that copying process, something goes wrong, okay, and again, that's due to we live in a fallen world, a broken world, and so times that happens. We see that happen within the human population. Sometimes, a good example of that would be, I'm trying to remember his name, Nick, I think it's Vujicic, I think, if I remember. Yeah, and he was born without arms and legs. Now he's made a wonderful life for himself. He accepted the Lord, and he's had a great ministry to people, since then. But again, it's here he is, born without what, his parents have arms and legs, but somewhere in the process of conception and the genetic code being copied, something went wrong, and he ended up being born without arms and legs. So same thing here, you end up with a offspring with stunted or short legs. That's a loss of information. That's not, okay, a gain of information. That's not new genetic information that's happened. And we may think those dogs are really cute and we keep them as household pets and so on and so forth. Now the other thing we have to keep in mind, if this dog was in the wild, that dog would not survive very long because it does not have what's called a functional advantage that would help it survive. It would get tracked down by predators and eaten quickly. So then when you go to the whole survival of the fittest, yes, we may think the dog is cute and we keep it as a pet and, cute little stubby legs and, run around the house, yip, 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 or whatever. Great, but it's only alive because I'm keeping it alive. If it was out in the wild, it would be gone like that. And so what happens is, as these dogs distribute their different genetic information, you end up with lots of dogs of all different kinds of varieties. And then after the flood, as they began to breed and separate to different areas of the world, you end up with different genetic strains that were in certain areas of the world. So you end up with a strain, maybe that's AB here, okay, and a certain kind, and these moved off into one area of the world. And so that's why you could go around the world and see, well, there's this kind of dog that lives in Australia, a dingo or whatever. And then, in North America, there's this kind of dog or whatever. Why are they different from one another? Because as they moved apart, they took those particular genetic strains and they interbred with one another, so those strains became concentrated within one another. Here's an example of deevolution. Okay, poodles. People love to breed poodles, and they're, I guess, supposedly great show dogs or whatever the case may be. But poodles are notorious for a tremendous amount of genetic defects there. And again, it's because there's so many, as we've bred and bred and bred and bred, poodles are not natural dogs. They've been specially bred and bred and bred and bred over hundreds of years to arrive at a very specific type of dog that looks a certain way, has a certain kind of hair. But as a result of that, there's a ton of genetic information that's been lost along the way, and because of that, it's prone to a tremendous amount of problems. Well, that's not evolution. It's not becoming better. It's not becoming more fit to survive. It's becoming less fit to survive. That's de-evolution. And so if I'm an evolutionist and I'm trying to use this as an example of evolution, this is exactly the opposite of what I want to use. Because this is an example that organisms are losing information as time goes by, not improving. Yes, can I breed animals and get a new characteristic that's and we do that all the time for purposes with cattle. We will breed cattle so that they can produce, or this particular kind of cattle will produce milk, large amounts of milk. Okay, we can do that. And again, that's part of obeying the creation mandate, to cultivate and to use what God has given us to cultivate and care for the earth, to rule and have dominion. Same thing, breeding a particular type of cattle for their beef, because they produce a really good quality beef, and so I'm going to breed that. Absolutely, can we do that? But again, along the way as I breed a particular animal, I am losing genetic information, not gaining it. Okay, we are going over all this here. And so the more genetic information lost, the closer an organism moves towards extinction. And I mentioned that gentleman who I went to the seminar in, and he was building a computer model to kind of predict, how many more years an organism could live before it reaches that point where it literally can't breed anymore and reproduce because of the genetic overload that's built up. There will become a point for us as humans as well, that genetic overload, each generation, there are a number of mutations where genetic information is either defective or completely lost. And, sorry to say this, but, if you think all the way back to Adam and Eve, we're genetically perfect, and then sin entered the world, and since that point in time on, we're really becoming worse. We're becoming, in a sense, dumber. And yes, we have more information available to us and more you want to say, knowledge available to us, but our ability to use those things is, we're slowly, bit by bit, de-evolving. And so here we'll take it and kind of just look real quickly at kind of races and skin colors and things like that, that sometimes is pointed to as evolution as well. Again, it's just recombinations of already existing genetic information, which is exactly what God would have built in at creation within Adam and Eve. And we've already seen how many potential combinations you can have and all the variation that you can have within a species here. So we're going to use skin color. I've got some pictures of some examples of that. Here you have two sisters, twin sisters. They had a black father, a white mother, and you have one who is darker skinned, okay, and one who is what we would consider to be white. Okay, same mother, same father. Again, all that is genetic variation. That's all it was. Okay. Now there's a more extreme example of these here, both of the mother and father have had black fathers and white mothers, so they had kind of some interesting genetic potential, and when they married and had children, they had twin girls, and surprise, surprise, one of them was white and one of them was black. And again, because they carried that genetic code within them because of their parents, and so they were able. Now, this is not common, but it is complete, and you can see God's, creative ability here, and that kind of goes, so then you start thinking, and here's kind of a close-up of them. Okay, cute little girls. So then you start thinking, okay, so what about, Adam and Eve? What would they have been? Well, definitely not, like some of the books, they weren't white, that's for sure, okay? What would they have been? Well, they would have been, a color that would have been able to produce all the different various colors that we ended up with. And so this idea really of race, okay, is kind of a superficial word, because really the differences that are between different groups of people are more cultural than they are racial than anything else. And it's cultures that have kind of developed these differences. Now within a culture, are you typically going to find a group of people that have maybe a certain type of skin or facial feature or hair color or whatever? Absolutely, but the reality is this, they're still people made in God's image. It's more the cultural differences that is different here. And there's really two, or I should say three major key points when you're talking about the disbursement of that genetic information. One is obviously Adam and Eve. Of course, everybody descended from them. And then God wiped out most of the people in the world, so you have Noah and his sons. So we're all descended from Noah and his sons. Most of us would probably be from, I want to say Japheth. I believe it's where we probably European ancestry and I believe would have come from. So most of us would probably be descended, if I'm remembering correctly. And then, of course, the Tower of Babel, okay, which was disobedience to God, where God had given the creation mandate again to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth, and they basically said, well, we don't want to fill the earth. We'll do the whole be fruitful and multiply, but we're not going to fill the earth. And God said, oh, really? You're not? Well, if you won't do it, I'll make you do it. And so when you think of, okay, well, probably what color were Adam and Eve? Well, they definitely weren't white, because white only has the characteristics to be able to produce more white. Black, same thing, the ability to produce more black, okay? So they were probably some shade of kind of in between there and had the genetic ability to have both. So they probably had children who were dark and probably children who were light, and in between. And you got to keep in mind, there's only 3 children of Adam and Eve that are actually mentioned in the Bible, but they probably had a lot more than that. Keep in mind that they lived, to be in their 900s. So, and we got to keep in mind that they would have aged much differently back then. So it's not like by the time they reached 100, they were, walking around like this, and they had another 800 years to go. They would have aged differently, again, because they were closer to genetic perfection, because the environment of the earth was much different, and the harmful effects of things like the sun and whatever would have been non-existent at that point in time. And so it's very possible Eve was having children, into her 400s or 500s. I know some of you women are hearing that like, oh, please no, so who knows how many children she ended up having. And so that's very possibly why the earth was populated within a short amount of time, within the 1,000 years between creation and the flood. If you had people living into their 900s and you're having babies into your 400s or 500s, or I don't know when, they would have stopped being able to have babies, and how the aging, you can imagine, you would still maybe be having children when you have great grandchildren, down the road there. Brian, you had a question?
Well, I was just going to say, Noah, that's about the only people that we, pre-flood people that was described when he had children, and that was like in his 400s.
Yeah.
So, or 400, so.
That's a great example. And so you have in the Bible here, Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel is the origin of all cultures and languages. There, and really the Tower of Babel is simply an opportunity for man to rebel against God. God had wiped out all wickedness of men, and it didn't take man very long to begin to have generations, and they all collect basically in one spot there in early Mesopotamia area, the plains of Shinar there, what would be by what would eventually become Babylon. And they decided to build the tower. And the issue was not, I've heard some teachers, oh, well, it says they were building a tower to heaven and God felt threatened, they might build it all the way up and, take, march an army up there, and weird theories. No, God is not threatened by mankind at all. That's stupid, okay? The issue was they were being disobedient to his command, and his command was to fill the earth, and they decided, no, we want to stay right here, and we want to make a name for ourselves. And God said, no, you're going to obey what I've asked you to do. And if you won't do it, I will make you do it. And so, of course, we all know what he did. He confused their languages, okay, and they couldn't communicate with one another. So what did that force them to do? Well, I'm going to take all the people I understand. We're going to go over here, and we're going to found our little civilization. And slowly but surely, okay, that forced them to spread throughout the earth. And then what did you get? Okay, you had people as they distributed and throughout the earth, you had a certain group of people who had certain facial features, certain skin color, and they were concentrated in a particular area. So as they began to reproduce, what did you have? You had people who looked like that concentrated in a certain area of the earth. And so, generally speaking, you got people who were kind of whitish skin color, okay, concentrated in what became kind of northern Europe, kind of area. You had people who had Asian type features concentrated in what now we call, okay, that area of Asia. And even there's differences between, those groups of people because of certain concentrations. So, you can go to China and they have certain facial features and skin color and things like that. And you go to Japan, they're similar, but they're not the same. There are differences, between them. Even within Europe, you can find areas of Europe. Well, if you go to England, obviously you're going to find a certain group of people. It's more of your Germanic type influence there. You go down to Spain, very different type of people. Okay, very different group of people there. And so even there, you see the genetic differences. Okay, what does God say about the races? He sees no difference in mankind. He desires all men to be united in Christ, And I pulled up this verse here. For there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Again, in God's eyes, he created us all. His plan for salvation was not just for the Jews. The Jews thought it was. Okay? But it was not just for the Jews. It was for the Jews and the Gentiles, that all might be redeemed underneath the name of Christ. That ultimately the offer of salvation is for everyone, that everyone might have an opportunity to dwell in eternity with him, that he might have fellowship with all of mankind, not just, well, these ones over here I really like, and the rest, you guys are all inferior. Forget you guys. And unfortunately, mankind throughout history, even the Jews themselves, were incredibly famous for this, of viewing ourselves as racially superior. Well, obviously we're God's chosen people. The rest of you are scum for the fires of hell. And we continue to see that in our world today. We see that in our country today. Now, I will say this, as much as different politicians and things like that want to try to promote our country as being incredibly racist and so on and so forth, we actually have one of the least racist countries in the world. I've been to a couple other countries. I've had students who've come from other countries, and I remember having a student from Korea, and she was not allowed to date anybody from another race at all, because that was taboo. So to come over here to America and date an American or anything like that, that was a no-no, because that's not what you did. And that's not what God desires. He desires us to be united. I'm going to kind of go off just a little bit on a tangent here, since we're dealing with race. What does the Bible have to address on that? And so sometimes this question comes up, well, does God prohibit interracial marriage? Then no. Okay, nowhere in the Bible does he ever prohibit interracial marriage. Matter of fact, you can see some examples of that. Moses, okay, his second wife was apparently African. After Zipporah died, we don't know when she died, but Moses apparently marries another wife, and that becomes an issue with Aaron and Miriam. Apparently they argue a little bit and get in trouble with Moses and God over that. But apparently he marries a woman from Africa below Egypt there. So there's interracial marriage evidence there within the Bible. The thing that God did prohibit is two things. First thing he did prohibit was intercultural marriage, only for the Israelites, for the sake of religious purity, because the land they were going into was filled with pagans and evil people, and God said, no, we're not going to do this. I don't want you mixing, because if you do, it has nothing to do with that they're of another culture or they're of another race. It has everything to do with, if you intermarry with them, then you're going to begin to worship their gods. And that's exactly what happened. If you go to the book of Judges, by the second and third chapter, it talks about what did the Israelites begin to do? They started to intermarry, and guess what happens? They're worshiping their gods within a short amount of time. And then God has to bring judgment because of their sin. God mentions something similar in the New Testament, that believers are not to be yoked together with unbelievers. So God does prohibit marriage to unbelievers. Okay, for the same reason, because there's no such thing as missionary dating. That's not what God desires. God did prohibit when the law was given. Now here we have to remember this, and this is something that sometimes is weird for us. God prohibited marriage between close relations, but not until the time of Moses. Now if you stop and think about it, who was Abraham married to? His half-sister. Okay? So prior to Moses, was marriage to close relations okay? It had to be, okay? Yeah, and you think about it, Adam and Eve, okay, their kids. Who did Cain, and Abel's kind of out of the picture because he was murdered, and Seth, okay, who did they marry?
Dating pool was limited.
Yeah, exactly, okay, they're sisters, okay? they married their sisters. And nowadays we think of that like, oh, okay, that's gross, that's disgusting. And it should be gross and disgusting now because God has forbid that now. He had not forbid it until, okay, the law. And so it's kind of just a little something to kind of view that here. You know, Adam and Eve all the way up until Leviticus, when the law is given, intermarriage is normal. It's okay. It's fine. And part of that is because here, okay, genetically perfect. Slowly over time are these harmful mutations creeping into the genetic code? Is there a loss of genetic information? And so over time, is it becoming more and more of an issue of close relations marrying one another? And we now know, due to medical science, that, hey, when you have close relations, there's all kinds of problems that can happen, okay? There's mental issues, there's diseases, okay, that can be common or prone to with marrying within close relations. And so at some point in time, God says, okay, we're going to draw a line here and say no more, because from here on out, marrying within close relations can cause harm to you. And because I'm a good God, I don't want you doing something that's destructive or harmful to you. So up to this point in time, it was not a big issue. Now we're starting to get to a point where, okay, it is going to be a big issue. So I'm going to draw a line here and I'm going to say no more of this. And now it's against God's law. Yes?
They've done some studies of the kings and royal families of Europe and a lot of the close interbreeding there.
Yep. And that was a mess.
And it's
Yeah.
not a good result.
Yeah. And we already mentioned that one, that God prohibits a marriage between a believer and a non-believer for the sake of spiritual purity. We'll skip that one here. Let's see here. Okay, I wanted to end with this, just kind of ending with taking a look at, because of evolution and the viewpoint of Darwinism, that began to, out of Darwinism, there began to be applied to society, what began to be called social Darwinism. And one of the areas that it was applied to was the area of races. And so some of the biggest racism has come out of this concept of evolution. And I just grabbed a couple quotes here. This is talking about the Bushmen of South Africa. And again, a quote here from Daniel G. Brinton. They enjoy the general reputation of being the lowest of the human race. Again, if I'm taking a view that certain groups of people have evolved further than others, and I can look around, well, obviously these people aren't very evolved over here, and so they must be inferior to me. And so the concept of a superior race, well, there should be, shouldn't there, if evolution is true? And so then you get to somebody like a Hitler who took social Darwinism and this concept and went to its extreme and not only said, well, there is a superior race, it's the German race, the Aryan, white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, that's the superior race, and then persecuted, okay, saw blacks, Jews, Slavs, okay, as inferior races and looked to exterminate them, okay, to literally wipe them out. And he's not the only one, okay, in this last century to pursue that. You have, again, some more quotes here, development of some of the Australians and things like that, and tribes of the Polynesians, okay, that they're at the lower level of development, okay? And I just wanted to kind of point this out, that when you pursue a Darwinian path and belief system, you can't just apply it to what we call science, it gets applied to society as well, and you end up developing some very dangerous ideas, and deadly ideas for that matter. And so, which is the exact opposite of what God's Word teaches us. God's Word teaches us that God created all mankind in His image, and so it doesn't matter what our skin color is, it doesn't matter what culture we come from. God desires all men to be trust in Him and to fear Him. God does not discriminate God does not have a superior race out there. He has a chosen people, okay? But there's no superior race, out there. And so we need to be very careful with where we go on this. I'm going to stop there this week. Next week, we'll be talking